Well, you're going to want to sit down for this, Gavin said, closing my office door behind him. He stood there looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight, his face pale and drawn. I've been lying to you about something big. I secretly gambled away $200,000 and used our company building as collateral, and it's about to come crashing down on both of us. I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. In 5 years of partnership, I'd never seen him look this terrified. What did you do, Gavin? The question hung in the air between us like a loaded gun. My heart started pounding as cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and I realized whatever he was about to tell me would change everything. Gavin stumbled into the chair across from my desk, his hands trembling, his usually crisp shirt wrinkled, and his tie loose around his neck like a noose he couldn't quite escape. The confident business partner I'd known for half a decade was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. I need to tell you something, he started, then stopped, running his fingers through his hair. God, I don't even know where to begin. I waited, watching him struggle with words that seemed to stick in his throat. Gavin was never at a loss for words. He was the one who pitched to investors, who charmed clients over dinner, who could talk his way out of any tight spot. Seeing him reduced to stammering fragments made me take a shallow breath. Just say it, I said, keeping my voice steady even though my pulse was picking up speed. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out. He let out a bitter laugh that had no humor in it. I've been gambling, he said, the words rushing out like water through a broken dam. Not just a little, not just weekends at Atlantic City or casual poker games with the guys. I mean real gambling. Online sites, underground games, sports betting, anything I could get my hands on. The revelation hit me like a physical blow because this was Gavin, the same man who wouldn't even buy a lottery ticket because he said the odds were stupid. His hands shook harder as he spoke, and I watched him grip the edge of my desk to steady himself. My first instinct was to laugh, but the look on his face killed any trace of amusement before it could form. This wasn't a joke or some elaborate prank. This was real, and it was destroying him from the inside out. How long? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. 18 months, he whispered. It started small. 100 here, maybe 500 there. I told myself I was just having fun, blowing off steam after those brutal client meetings we were having last year. But then I started winning sometimes, and when you win, it feels like you're invincible, like you've cracked some secret code that nobody else knows. He paused, staring at his hands. The wins made me think I could handle bigger bets. That, I was good at it. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs as the implications started to sink in. How much? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. How much of our money did you steal? 200,000, he said, and I felt my knees go weak. But that's not the worst part. He was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he looked up at me. I couldn't cover the losses anymore. The people I owe money to, they're not patient. They're not the kind of people who accept payment plans or sob stories about bad luck. My mouth went dry. What did you do? I used the building as collateral, he said, and the words hit me like a physical blow. Our building, the one we bought together, the one our offices are in. I signed papers putting it up against my debts. He was sobbing now, his whole body shaking. They have a legal claim on our property. If I can't pay them back in 2 weeks, they take everything. I sank back into my chair, feeling like the floor had disappeared beneath me. The building wasn't just our office space. It was our biggest asset, our security, the foundation of everything we'd built together. And now strangers had their hands on it because of Gavin's lies. Who are these people? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. Loan sharks, he whispered, the kind who don't take no for an answer. I stared at him across my desk, watching him fall apart, and realized this was just the beginning. Please tell me you didn't touch the company account, I whispered, but his silence told me everything I needed to know. The silence stretched between us as the full scope of his betrayal became clear. Show me everything, I said, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. Every lie, every fake document, every single thing you've been hiding from me. Gavin looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, but I wasn't letting him off that easy. Start talking, and don't you dare leave anything out. He pulled out his laptop with shaking hands, opening 2 versions of our company's financial dashboard. I've been keeping duplicate books for months, he admitted, showing me how he'd created one set with real numbers, showing the missing money, and another with fabricated figures that made everything look normal. Every time you looked at our profit and loss statements, you were seeing numbers I'd altered. My rage built as I stared at the screens, the monthly reports I'd trusted, the quarterly projections I'd based decisions on, the budget meetings where we'd celebrated our success. All of it had been a performance built on lies. You made me look like an idiot, I said. I've been telling people we're profitable when we're actually hemorrhaging money because of your gambling. It gets worse, Gavin said, pulling up our banking interface. I've been forging your signature on loan applications and credit line extensions. He showed me documents I'd never seen before, all bearing my name in handwriting that looked remarkably close to my own. I practiced your signature for weeks until I could replicate it perfectly. The banks never questioned it because we'd always handled paperwork together before. I stared at the screen in disbelief. There were dozens of documents, each one representing another layer of deception that Gavin had carefully constructed, while I remained completely unaware. You've been committing fraud using my identity, I said, the full weight of his betrayal hitting me. These loans are in both our names. If you default, they come after me too. Gavin nodded miserably. I modified our accounting software to hide the missing funds. Every time I transferred money out for gambling, I created fake invoices to justify the expense. He pulled up one particularly elaborate fake invoice for a $15,000 consulting service from a company called Strategic Solutions Group, complete with official letterhead and detailed project descriptions. I even created fake vendor accounts with payment schedules. The system shows legitimate business expenses, but every transaction was just me funneling money to gambling sites. The sophistication of his deception was staggering. This wasn't desperate last-minute theft. This was calculated fraud that had been planned and executed over months. How long have you been planning this? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. I started setting up the fake systems over a year ago, he said, avoiding my eyes. When the gambling first got serious, I knew I'd need a way to access company funds without you noticing. I spent months researching how to manipulate our software, how to create convincing fake documentation, how to make everything look legitimate if anyone ever audited us. My hands clenched into fists. A year. He'd been lying to my face and stealing from our business for an entire year while I trusted him completely. How did you fool our accountant? I demanded. She reviews everything quarterly. I gave her modified reports and told her we were investing heavily in digital marketing and technology upgrades, Gavin said. I created entire presentations about new software packages and consulting services that didn't exist. She believed it because the numbers seemed reasonable and the invoices looked legitimate. The room felt like it was spinning. Our accountant, someone I respected and trusted, had been unknowingly helping Gavin cover up his theft by accepting his fabricated explanations. You've compromised everyone around us, I said, realizing how many people would be affected when this came to light. There's more, Gavin whispered. I've been borrowing against our client contracts without authorization. Several of our biggest accounts are now tied up as collateral for loans you don't know about. He pulled up documents showing our most valuable client relationships had been pledged as security for his gambling debts. If word gets out about any of this, we'll lose every major client we have. My vision blurred with rage. Not only had he stolen from our business and forged my signature, but he'd also put our professional reputation at risk. Our clients trusted us, I said, my voice shaking. These are relationships we've spent years building, and you've turned them into gambling chips. The creditors are getting impatient, Gavin said, his voice barely audible. I've been stalling them with promises about big payments coming soon, but they're starting to ask questions about our business legitimacy. He paused, his face going even paler. And if you think that's bad, wait until you hear who I actually borrowed from. The names he mentioned made my blood run cold. These aren't bank loan officers or credit card companies, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The people I borrowed from operate out of back rooms in Queens. They don't file paperwork. They watch you from parked cars until you pay up. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his coffee cup. When you can't pay traditional lenders, they write off the debt and move on. These people don't write anything off. Ever. My throat tightened as I realized there was no bank to appeal to, no customer service department to negotiate with. We were dealing with criminals who solved problems with violence. How did you even find these people? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Online gambling sites connect you with other players, Gavin said, avoiding my eyes. When you're losing big and running out of options, someone always knows someone who can help. They start small, maybe a few thousand with reasonable terms. But once you're in their system, once they have your information, you become a customer for life. He paused, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the air conditioning running full blast. They don't advertise what happens when you can't pay because they don't need to. Everyone knows. My stomach dropped as I realized we were now part of that system. What kind of threats are we talking about? I asked, though I could already guess the answer from the terror in Gavin's eyes. They started calling me 3 weeks ago, he said, his voice cracking. Not during business hours. They call at 2 a.m, or while I'm having dinner with my family. The first guy was polite, almost friendly. He just wanted to remind me that payment was coming due soon. But the calls got more specific. They know where I live, where my kids go to school, what time I usually get home from work. Gavin's hands were trembling as he pulled out his phone, showing me a string of missed calls from unknown numbers. Last week, someone was sitting in a car outside my apartment building when I got home. They didn't do anything, just sat there watching me walk to my door. The message was clear. The room felt like it was closing in around me. I could barely breathe as I realized that Gavin's problems had become my problems. Do they know about me? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Gavin nodded miserably. They know everything about our business partnership. They know your name, your address, your daily routine. One of them mentioned seeing you at the coffee shop on 3rd Street last Tuesday morning around 9:30. The specificity of that detail hit me like a punch to the gut. I did go to that coffee shop every Tuesday morning, usually around the same time. They've been watching both of us for weeks, learning our patterns, figuring out how to apply pressure if they need to. My hands went cold as I processed what he was telling me. These people had been conducting surveillance on me without my knowledge, treating me like a target because of Gavin's gambling addiction. What else do they know? I yelled. They have photos, Gavin whispered. Pictures of our office building, our client meetings, even some of our employees coming and going. They showed me one of you shaking hands with that contractor we hired last month. His voice broke completely. They're not just threatening our safety. They're threatening our entire professional existence. I felt sick thinking about strangers taking pictures of me going about my normal business day, cataloging my movements like I was some kind of criminal they were tracking. What's their reputation for collecting debts? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. They don't accept partial payments or payment plans, Gavin said. I asked around after the first threatening call. People who've dealt with them before said they give you one deadline, and if you miss it, they take whatever they want to make themselves whole. Sometimes that means your house. Sometimes it means your business. Sometimes it means things you can't replace. The implication hung in the air between us. They gave me exactly 2 weeks from today. If I don't have their money by then, they start taking assets. Our building is first on their list. The finality of that deadline hit me like a physical blow. 2 weeks wasn't enough time to liquidate assets or secure legitimate financing. It wasn't enough time to find buyers for our business or negotiate any kind of reasonable settlement. And now they're coming for our office building. What can we do in 2 weeks? By 2 a.m., I'd read and reread every clause in our partnership deal, surrounded by legal documents and coffee cups at my kitchen table. The harsh light above my stove cast shadows across partnership agreements and business law articles, as I searched for anything that might give me leverage against the nightmare Gavin had created. My eyes burned from staring at screens, but I kept going, fueled by desperation and the faint hope that somewhere in all this legal jargon was a solution. Section 12 of our partnership agreement jumped out at me like a neon sign. Neither partner may pledge assets without written consent from both of us. My heart started racing as I read it again, then a third time. Gavin had never asked for my permission. He'd never even mentioned the possibility. This was it. The crack in his seemingly perfect trap. I pulled up more sections of our agreement, finding clause after clause that Gavin had violated. He couldn't borrow against client contracts without my approval. He couldn't sign loan documents using company assets as security without my signature. He couldn't even open new business credit accounts without joint authorization. Every single thing he'd done to cover his gambling debts was explicitly prohibited by the legal framework we'd established when we started the company. My research led me to court cases where similar situations had played out. Precedents from 3 states voided similar unauthorized pledges when business partners acted without proper consent. Case after case showed the same pattern. When one partner exceeded their authority, the agreements they made weren't legally binding on the partnership. At 3 in the morning, I called our business attorney. David had handled our incorporation paperwork and contract reviews for years, and he knew our partnership structure better than anyone. His voicemail picked up, but I left a detailed message explaining the situation and asking him to call me first thing in the morning. I needed professional confirmation of what I was discovering in my research. David called back at 7:30 sharp. His voice was grim as I explained Gavin's deception, but it got more confident as I described the unauthorized collateral agreements. "Those loan sharks don't have a valid claim on your business property," he said. "Gavin exceeded his authority as a partner. Any agreements he made using company assets without your written consent are legally questionable at best." Relief washed over me like tide water, the first real breath I'd taken since Gavin walked into my office yesterday. But David wasn't finished. He explained that New York state law specifically protects business owners from unauthorized debt obligations created by their partners. I could file for an emergency injunction to prevent any seizure of business assets, while we challenge the validity of Gavin's agreements. "There are federal laws that apply here too," David continued. "The Uniform Partnership Act gives you protection against exactly this kind of situation. When a partner acts outside their authority, especially regarding significant business assets, those actions can be voided if challenged properly." He paused, and I could hear him flipping through papers. "We can also pursue criminal charges against Gavin for fraud and forgery. Using your signature without permission on loan documents is a felony." My confidence grew with every legal protection David outlined. I'd been thinking like a victim, assuming Gavin's actions had trapped me in an impossible situation. But the law was on my side. Gavin had violated multiple statutes and breached our partnership agreement in ways that gave me significant leverage. The loan sharks might be dangerous, but their claim on our business property was built on illegal actions that wouldn't hold up in court. David's plan was straightforward. File an emergency motion to void all unauthorized collateral agreements, request immediate asset protection to prevent seizure while the case proceeded, and prepare criminal referrals for Gavin's fraudulent activities. I hung up the phone feeling like I'd discovered a hidden weapon in what seemed like an unwinnable fight. Gavin had led me to believe I was powerless, that his gambling debts had doomed us both. But he'd been wrong about the law, just like he'd been wrong about gambling. The legal system had protections specifically designed for situations like this, and I intended to use every single one of them. Now it was time to have another conversation with my partner. I walked into Gavin's office carrying a manila folder thick with legal documents. He looked up from his computer with red-rimmed eyes that suggested he hadn't slept any better than I had. "We need to talk," I said, closing the door behind me and taking the seat across from his desk. My voice was calm, controlled, nothing like the rage that had consumed me the day before. "I spent the night doing some research, and there are things you need to know about the legal mess you've created." Gavin straightened in his chair, probably expecting another emotional outburst about betrayal and broken trust. Instead, I opened the folder and pulled out our partnership agreement, marked with yellow highlighter in several places. "Section 12, I said, sliding the document across his desk. "Read it out loud." His face went pale as he scanned the highlighted text. The clause was crystal clear. Neither partner could pledge company assets as collateral without written consent from both parties. "I already spoke with David this morning," I continued, watching Gavin's expression shift from confusion to dawning horror. "He confirmed what I suspected. Every single collateral agreement you signed is legally invalid. You exceeded your authority as a partner, which means those loan sharks don't actually have a valid claim on our building." I pulled out more documents from the folder. Court cases from 3 states where similar unauthorized collateral agreements were thrown out by judges. Gavin flipped through the legal precedents I'd compiled, his hands shaking. He tried to argue that the loan sharks wouldn't care about legal technicalities, that they'd take whatever they could get their hands on regardless of paperwork. But his voice was weak and desperate, the fight already draining out of him as he realized the implications. "Actually, we can fight them with paperwork," I said, pulling out the final set of documents. "David is filing an emergency injunction this afternoon to freeze all business assets and prevent any seizure, while we challenge the validity of your agreements. The courts will side with us because you committed fraud when you forged my signature on those loan documents." I leaned back in my chair, studying his face as the full implications hit him. "That's a felony, Gavin. Criminal charges, not just civil liability." The blood drained from his face completely. "You wouldn't," he whispered. "We've been friends for years, partners. You can't just destroy my life because I made some mistakes." His voice cracked as he spoke, but I felt no sympathy. The man sitting across from me had been willing to destroy my life to cover his gambling addiction. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice as cold as winter air. "You're going to contact those loan sharks today and explain that their collateral claim is invalid. You're going to tell them that any attempt to seize business property will result in criminal charges and federal intervention. And you're going to make it clear that this debt is yours alone, not the company's." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "If you refuse, I file criminal charges against you this afternoon, and let the prosecutors sort out the rest." Gavin stared at me in shock, asking how I could throw him under the bus after everything we'd built together. The audacity of that question almost made me laugh. He'd been willing to sacrifice our entire business for his gambling habit, but somehow I was the bad guy for refusing to go down with him. "I'm going to save the business we built," I corrected. "You made your choice when you started stealing from our accounts and forging my signature. I'm just making mine." I pulled out my phone and showed him the contact information for our accountant. "I've already scheduled a meeting to separate all business assets from any personal claims against you. Your gambling debts are your problem, not mine." The desperation in his eyes was complete now. He begged for another way, promising to get help for his gambling problem and pay back every penny. But I'd already made my decision. "The partnership is over," I said, standing up and gathering my documents. "But the business will survive without you. I've already spoken with our major clients about transitioning to single ownership." I walked toward the door, then turned back for one final statement. "You have until 5 o'clock today to make those calls to your loan sharks. After that, David files everything with the courts and the district attorney's office." I felt no regret, only resolve. The scared, betrayed partner from yesterday was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival sometimes required cutting away the dead weight. But as I left Gavin's office, I knew the real test would come when I had to face the loan sharks myself and convince them that their intimidation tactics wouldn't work on someone who understood the law. At a corner table on West 47th, I laid out our case to the sharks' reps. I arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a spot where I could see both entrances and keep my back to the wall. My briefcase sat beside me, filled with legal documents that I hoped would be more powerful than any weapon these people might carry. Two men walked in at exactly 3 o'clock, scanning the room with the practiced efficiency of people who made their living assessing threats. The older one was compact and well-dressed, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His younger companion was broader, with hands that looked like they'd seen plenty of use in negotiations that didn't involve paperwork. They spotted me immediately and walked over without hesitation. "You must be Gavin's partner," the older man said, sliding into the seat across from me while his associate remained standing. "I'm Vincent, and this is my colleague Tony. We understand you wanted to discuss some concerns about our business, arrangement with your friend." His polite tone masked a vein of steel that made my mouth go dry. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the legal documents, keeping my hand steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Gavin didn't have the legal authority to pledge our business property without my written consent," I said, sliding our partnership agreement across the table, along with the court precedents I'd researched. "The agreement you have with him is invalid under New York partnership law, and these cases show how similar situations played out in court." Vincent's expression didn't change as he scanned the highlighted sections, but Tony shifted slightly behind him, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "Are you telling us we wasted our time?" Tony asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made my survival instincts scream warnings. "I'm offering you a better solution," I said, pulling out the final document from my briefcase. "I'll point you to Gavin's unprotected assets, his apartment, his car, his personal bank accounts, his investment portfolio, and you back off our building." I slid the asset summary across the table, showing Gavin's personal financial situation. "This approach avoids legal complications and gets you closer to actual recovery." Vincent leaned back in his chair, studying the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood the value of information. "Interesting," he said after several long minutes. "You're suggesting that our friend Gavin wasn't entirely honest with us about his ability to make certain promises." "Gavin destroyed our partnership when he started stealing company money and forging my signature," I said, meeting Vincent's gaze directly. "I have no interest in protecting someone who was willing to sacrifice my business for his gambling addiction. But I also have no interest in letting his mistakes destroy everything I've worked for. Helping you recover from his personal assets serves both our interests." Tony looked at Vincent, who nodded slightly. "You're proposing to help us collect from your business partner?" Vincent asked, raising an eyebrow. "That seems unusually cooperative for someone who claims we have no valid claim." "Gavin made his choice when he decided to gamble with other people's money," I said. "I'm just making mine." Vincent spent several more minutes reviewing the legal documents and asset information, occasionally murmuring comments to Tony that I couldn't quite hear. Finally, he gathered everything together and handed it back to me. "Your legal analysis appears sound," he said, standing up from the table. "And your proposal has merit. We'll pursue collection through Gavin's personal assets and release any claims against the business property." Relief flooded through me as Vincent extended his hand. "We appreciate your cooperation in resolving this matter efficiently," he said, shaking my hand with surprising firmness. "Gavin will be hearing from us directly about his personal obligations. You won't be involved in those conversations." As they walked away, I realized I still had a pulse. The legal protections had worked exactly as David promised, and Gavin would face the consequences of his gambling addiction without dragging me down with him. But I knew this was just the beginning of a much longer process that would determine whether justice would truly be served. 3 weeks later, I watched Gavin in an orange jumpsuit walk into the federal courtroom. The detective had called that morning to let me know they were transferring him from the city jail to face federal charges for wire fraud and identity theft. His gambling addiction had finally caught up with him in ways that no amount of charm or smooth talking could fix. The man who used to command boardrooms and close million-dollar deals was now facing 5 to 10 years in federal prison. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness watching him disappear through the courthouse doors. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for Gavin, to remember the friendship we'd shared before gambling consumed his life. But then I thought about the sleepless nights he'd caused me, the months of lies, the way he'd been willing to sacrifice everything we'd built together for another bet. He'd made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. The federal prosecutor had made it clear that Gavin's cooperation in providing information about the loan sharks wouldn't reduce his sentence significantly. Fraud was fraud, regardless of the underlying addiction. The business survived without him, though rebuilding trust took months of careful communication with clients and vendors. I spent countless hours in meetings explaining Gavin's departure without revealing the full extent of his criminal behavior. And most clients stayed once they understood that new financial controls were in place. I implemented comprehensive oversight measures that would have prevented Gavin's theft from the beginning. Every transaction over $5,000 now requires dual authorization, and monthly bank reconciliations are handled by an outside accounting firm with automatic alerts for any attempts to modify financial records. The new partnership agreements I use for any business relationships contain ironclad provisions about asset protection and unauthorized use of company resources. Every potential partner undergoes comprehensive background checks that include credit history, gambling activity monitoring, and reference calls to previous business associates. I learned that trust without verification is just naive hope dressed up as business wisdom. Real protection comes from systems that assume people might make bad choices and build safeguards accordingly. My approach to client relationships changed too. I started requiring more detailed contracts that spell out exactly what happens if business partnerships dissolve or if key personnel leave the company. Clients appreciate the clarity because it protects them as much as it protects me. I also began maintaining larger cash reserves to handle unexpected disruptions without scrambling for emergency financing or making desperate decisions under pressure. The experience taught me to recognize warning signs I'd missed with Gavin. Subtle changes in behavior, unexplained absences from important meetings, reluctance to discuss specific financial details, defensiveness about routine business oversight. I now pay attention when partners become secretive about their personal lives or start avoiding direct questions about company operations. These aren't accusations or signs of distrust. They're just data points that require additional verification. 6 months after Gavin's sentencing, I received a letter from him in federal prison apologizing for the betrayal and asking for forgiveness. I read it twice, then filed it away without responding. Some bridges burned completely, and trying to rebuild them just wastes energy that's better spent moving forward. The business is more profitable now than it ever was with Gavin involved. Removing the constant drain of his gambling losses freed up resources for legitimate growth and expansion. I hired 2 new employees and opened a second office location. Client satisfaction scores improved because I could focus entirely on service delivery instead of constantly worrying about hidden problems or financial irregularities that might surface without warning. Looking back, I realized that Gavin's betrayal forced me to become a better businessman. The legal protections I learned about, the financial controls I implemented, the verification systems I put in place. All of these made the company stronger and more resilient. I'm more cautious now about who I trust with sensitive information, but I'm also more confident in my ability to handle whatever challenges might arise. The loan sharks never contacted me again after our coffee shop meeting. Gavin's personal assets covered most of what he owed them, and the legal complications I'd outlined convinced them to write off the remaining balance rather than pursue further collection efforts. I traded blind faith for ironclad safeguards, and my business is stronger for it. What started as a routine day in my office nearly ended with strangers seizing our building because my partner secretly gambled away $200,000. The most expensive lesson I ever learned cost me a friendship, but saved my business. Gavin taught me that trust without verification isn't wisdom. It's just wishful thinking dressed up as partnership. Here's what every business owner needs to know. Trust, but verify with dual sign-off for any major financial decisions. Install real-time financial alerts that catch unusual transactions before they drain your accounts. Build legal guardrails into every partnership agreement that prevent unauthorized use of company assets. Remember, the person you trust most might be the one who destroys you, but proper legal safeguards will protect you when they do. If this story resonated, hit like, share your wildest partnership nightmare below, and subscribe for more true life lessons from the business trenches.